pleasure to have you here and to be with Ambassador Shapiro. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be with you, Jacob.
Great. So you're in Israel right now. We have a wave of terrorism. It's a tender situation. I was wondering, personally and professionally, how is it for you? And professionally, what's your job in a time like this? What's an ambassador's job, and what's the job of the United States?
Well, thanks for the opportunity, and thanks to everybody at the GA, and it's an honor and pleasure to join this important conference. It has been a very difficult several weeks with this wave of terror, which started or derived out of tensions surrounding the holy sites in Jerusalem, questions about the status quo and questions about different religious communities' rights on those sites. And initially, the violence that we saw was focused primarily on that site. Mm-hmm. Actually, over a period of several weeks, our own efforts, led by Secretary of State Kerry and those of others, helped actually to bring some kind of calming effect to the site itself. When mm-hmm. Secretary Kerry met with Prime Minister Netanyahu in Berlin, and then met with King Abdullah and with President Abbas in Amman a couple of days later, of course was supporting those meetings, he was able to develop a certain set of understandings about the status quo, how it is maintained, what its meaning is, how it will be monitored, including through the installation of cameras on the site. And in the last 3 or 4 weeks, things have been much quieter and calmer on the site. Muslims have come up to pray, non-Muslims have come up to visit, and things have proceeded much more calmly. So one of our roles has been to be the convener of those kinds of discussions, even if they're not face-to-face discussions by the parties. But unfortunately, the terror and the violence has spilled out into the neighborhoods of East Jerusalem and even to other parts of Israel and other parts of the West Bank. And obviously, as an ambassador who has protection and bodyguards, it doesn't necessarily affect me in the same way it affects most citizens of Israel, although I have to say, you know, even with the fine professionals who help me, I find myself a little more on guard just going around Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or wherever it is I am. I have a daughter who studies at a high school in Ra'anana, and I think people will remember there was a day when there were 2 stabbings on the streets of Ra'anana in very public, well-trafficked places. And so we as a family understood that it affects our family as well. It affects every Israeli family. Our role here in a situation like this is number one, to be very clear about condemning terror. There's never an excuse for terror. There's never an excuse for stabbing civilians or for running them over at bus stops. To condemn and call out incitement that often is part of the fuel for terror. Obviously to provide a sense of solidarity to the Israeli people who are experiencing it by visiting people in hospitals, attending funerals, and so forth. And still to look for those openings for a diplomatic set of steps that can help lower tensions, that can help lower rhetoric, that can help give people something positive to hold on to, so they're not in whatever feelings of despair or whatever emotions that are stirred up by events in Jerusalem on holy sites or by inciting rhetoric, not driven toward that terrible choice of using violence, but that they see that there is another path to address whatever concerns they have. So we continue to look for those ways. That will include tomorrow's meeting between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu to look for those opportunities, steps that Israel can take. Of course, we also look to steps others can take, including the Palestinian Authority, that will lower tensions and provide a more positive basis for people to turn away from violence.
Now, you mentioned the meeting tomorrow between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Obama. This is not their first rodeo. We've been through quite a few of these during the course of both administrations in Israel and the United States. So I'm wondering, what are your expectations from tomorrow's meeting as opposed to some others? What are your expectations for that?
Well, you did title this session "The Relationship Status," and it's complicated. And as an avid user of social media and my outreach to the Israeli public, I'm inclined to accept the framing of the discussion. And tomorrow's meeting will be obviously the latest. This is their 14th or 15th meeting, I believe, in a relationship that obviously goes through certain phases and certain cycles. But the fundamentals of which, the bedrock and the basis of which, really has never changed. And that's a positive thing. It's never changed in the sense of a very strong, deeply felt commitment and policy and sense of our own interests in having the closest possible relationship with Israel, in helping Israel achieve its goals of security, its qualitative military edge, its ability to defend itself, particularly in a very chaotic and dangerous region, and its goals of achieving peace with its neighbors, including a two-state solution with Palestinians. Those have always been bedrock principles, and nothing about them has changed, even though we have been through complicated periods in this relationship, even though, particularly in the last year, we've been through very public disagreements in this relationship. So one of the things I think we look to for tomorrow is a sense of a chapter having closed. We can't deny that over the last year we had a very difficult and very public disagreement, and one never likes to have a public disagreement with a friend or someone close to you. Imagine arguing in public with a spouse or a sibling or a good friend. It's not pleasant, particularly on something so important. It was an honest disagreement about a shared strategic goal of ensuring that Iran never achieves a nuclear weapon, but a disagreement about the best way to achieve it. It was honest. I think maybe we could have made different decisions about how it was expressed, but it's over. The deal has been signed, it's been implemented, it's passed its congressional review, and it's the very clear understanding of both sides going into this meeting that we're not going to rehash that disagreement. It would be somewhat pointless to do so. And the bedrock commitments of the relationship require us to look forward. And so there are several things about which we look forward in a sense of commonality and a convergence of our interests. First of all, implementation and enforcement of the agreement, making sure that Iran lives up to its commitments to ensure that there's never going to be an Iranian nuclear weapon, and that we have the ability to monitor that and to respond if there are any violations, including through snapback of sanctions or even maintaining a military option, which we do. That's one area of convergence. Another is countering other non-nuclear Iranian threats, and we have no illusions, never have, that Iran continues to be a very dangerous actor in the region, that sponsors terrorist organizations, that provides weapons to Hezbollah and Hamas and others, that destabilizes other regimes, and that we in Israel have already been working by sharing intelligence and designating actors for sanctions and interdicting weapon shipments and other means to counter those threats, but we're going to need to intensify that effort in the years ahead. We have a common interest in ensuring that the civil war in Syria does not spill over and affect Israel through violence or through other threats. Also, that civil war does not prevent us from prosecuting our campaign to degrade and defeat ISIL. So there's a lot of commonalities and a lot of joint interests and joint work that's going to be done together, including, maybe we'll talk about it, about our own security assistance to Israel. So I really see tomorrow as a meeting where the two leaders who know each other well and who have worked together through all those ups and downs are really going to be charting the course of the last year of the Obama administration together around those areas of common interest.
Now, with regards to both the meeting and Iran, which we've touched on both issues already, but some of the latest media reports in recent days have indicated that Israel planned to ask for $5 billion annually in aid from the United States. That would be up from roughly $3 billion, and some of the reports indicated that President Obama would reject that offer. So I'm wondering what you think are the implications of these figures being discussed, 5 billion, 3 billion, besides the mathematics, besides 2 billion. What's the difference? What can you say about this? What's the real story here?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think it's premature to talk about specific numbers, but there's already a very detailed and professional discussion underway to do a couple of things. In the first instance, to ensure that we have a common understanding of the threat picture that Israel faces. I touched on some of those. Even if we agree, and I actually think, as I listen to Israeli analysts, there is a certain understanding of this, that the threat of an Iranian nuclear weapon is certainly not going to be upon us in the next 10 to 15 years, and maybe considerably longer under this agreement. Remain many other threats, and so understanding what those threats are, understanding where they come from. Some of them come from Iran itself in terms of the behaviors I described, even Iran's own conventional capabilities. Some of them come from potential spillover of the civil war in Syria, or the 100,000 roughly rockets and missiles that Hezbollah possesses, or Gaza, which has been a source of 3 wars that Israel's had to fight in the last several years. So understanding and there's the instability of these transitions in the Arab world that seem to roil the entire region, as well as the emergence of ISIL. So we can talk about all these different threats. And then that conversation is already underway. And then we need to look at what systems are most relevant to help Israel defend itself against those threats. So, for example, Israel has already made the decision to purchase 33 F-35 Joint Strike Fighters. That's the most advanced fighter aircraft ever built. They will be the only air force in the Middle East to fly that aircraft. I think they're giving serious consideration. They always have been to buying enough to make 2 squadrons, which is 50. I think they are now considering whether a 3rd squadron to get to 75 F-35s is relevant. There are certain types of munitions that we do provide, but quantities and precise divisions of how to spend those dollars is relevant. Our missile defense programs, which are frankly not funded through the FMF of this MOU, they're funded through a separate, that's a State Department account. They're funded through a separate Defense Department account. But those have been incredibly important and are clearly very relevant to the most significant threats that Israel identifies from Iran, from Hezbollah, from Hamas. And so I anticipate a focus on upgrading our cooperation around the Iron Dome, the David Sling, and the Arrow systems. So what I expect will emerge from the meeting tomorrow is not a focus on a number, but a focus on a common strategic understanding that will allow President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu to give instructions to their defense professionals to then sit down and craft a package, hopefully a 10-year MOU package, that will be most relevant and most on point in addressing the most pressing threats. Everything in life requires making choices and priorities. There are budget realities that both of us face. We have limits to what money is available. Israel, in its own budget debate, is constantly deciding how much is the right amount for defense spending against other priorities. And so those are also relevant factors. So it's not for the two of them tomorrow to agree on a number. It's to agree on a common strategic picture that will inform the negotiations over the next weeks and months.
Now, we were also reading in some reports Friday, citing actually some briefings and statements by yourself and Robert Malley and other administration officials regarding some pessimism on the part of the president about the prospects for a peace agreement between the Israelis and Palestinians during the duration of his term. And of course, there were United States brokered peace talks earlier in this term. And I'm wondering if you think does this mark a policy change, just an attitude change on the part of the United States administration with regards to the peace process? What's the pulse of that issue right now?
Well, it's not a policy change in this sense. The president, from his first day in office, and he appointed George Mitchell as his special envoy, I guess on his second day in office, has always felt and continues to feel and believe today that a 2 states for 2 people solution is imperative for Israel's future as a Jewish and democratic state, and for its long-term security, opportunities for broader relations in the Arab world, and so forth. for Palestinians to achieve their legitimate rights of self-determination in a state of their own, and for our own interests in terms of how it affects our posture and our position in the region. So that hasn't changed, and it won't change. And frankly, I don't think that's a difference between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu. Prime Minister Netanyahu speaks regularly about his desire to avoid a binational state, which I think is saying the same thing about the concern that the failure to have a two-state outcome leads to a one-state binational state that is not the Zionist vision of a Jewish and democratic state in the historic land of Israel. So that policy hasn't changed and won't change. However, there is a certain recognition of a reality, not a reality we would have chosen, of course, and it's we arrive at it with some sorrow. After two very prominent efforts to promote negotiations in the first term with George Mitchell and the second term with Secretary Kerry and Martin Indyk as our special envoy, both of which failed, and we have to acknowledge the failure. We think, given the current set of circumstances, the time available, the relationship between the two leaders, which is not one of trust, the relationships between the populations, which frankly also is not one of great trust, the violence that's occurred, that the great likelihood is we will not achieve a two-state solution in our remaining time in President Obama's term, and may well not even be able to achieve negotiations, again, because of the overhang of the failure of the previous negotiation and a lot of the violence that has followed. So that's a reality that we wish were otherwise, but would be irresponsible not to recognize and adjust our approach accordingly. So the change, if it's a change, is that we may not be able to invest the same kind of time that Secretary Kerry did in March 2013 to get negotiations launched, starting in March 2013, which was an incredible investment of time and energy and diplomatic capital when we have many, many other priorities in the world and considering the low likelihood of success. And so our focus now is to put before the parties, including in tomorrow's meeting with the Prime Minister, but also with many conversations with the Palestinians, the question, what steps can they take on the ground that can really, number one, build some trust and make a positive difference for people's lives, whether it's in the economic sphere or in the security sphere. And importantly, how can those steps be framed and understood to be preparing for the transition that is contemplated by previous agreements to achieve a two-state solution? It's very important to keep that reality and that hope and that possibility alive. The most dangerous situation, seems to me, would be one where Israelis and Palestinians and many others in the world begin to reach the conclusion that there simply won't be a two-state solution, that there's going to be a one-state or some version of the status quo outcome for the rest of time. Because with that kind of despair and with that kind of reaction that people will have to that realization, there are a lot of very dangerous things could happen in terms of violence, in terms of Israel's relationships in the world, and in other ways. So it's important that both sides find those steps and take those steps that give a realistic understanding that they are preparing for transition, even if the negotiations, which must happen, won't happen until later, even if it may be a number of years into the future before a final agreement could be reached. There has to be a direction charted by the parties themselves, by actions they take, that point to that and keep it alive as a viable option. And that's what I think will be the focus of the discussion tomorrow.
Okay. So you might notice me mentioning reports said this, reports said that, the media said this on Friday, the newspaper said this on Thursday. Sitting from your chair, here in Tel Aviv, as a person with some authority and reading journalists like myself sort of speculate about what's going on, I'm wondering what you think of that, what you think of the media coverage of Israel and specifically of U.S.-Israel relations these days.
I think there has been, over the course of these years of President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu serving together, a perhaps understandable but probably an excessive focus on the two leaders and their personal relationship, kind of putting them on the couch, as it were, to analyze their emotions about each other, about the relationship, and so on. And again, it's understandable. There's always a human element to leadership relationships and to international relations. It's not that it has no relevance, but I think it has been pursued to excess. I'm not criticizing a particular journalist, but I think the overall narrative is one that has focused on that too much, in the sense that it has lost the focus on those bedrock commitments and stability and very positive joint security cooperation that goes on day in and day out, and that the two of them get credit for. This is the part I think is puzzling. There's no question they've had their disagreements, and we've talked about some of them. And again, that's perfectly normal and perfectly. There's a lot of precedent for it in the U.S.-Israel relationship and in other relationships, and it happens. So maybe they get more public, maybe than they might have. There's no question that there are people, I won't characterize them further, in both countries who seem to have an interest in stoking that sense of controversy and conflict when perhaps it's less than meets the eye. But those same two leaders, who are considered to be leaders who've had disagreements and who are often put on the couch to analyze how they feel about each other, are the two leaders who have together achieved what is widely acknowledged by security professionals and many others in both countries as the highest and most intensive and most successful security cooperation we've ever achieved in intelligence sharing, in missile defense, in dealing with the aftermath of the transitions in the Arab world, in, frankly, building the sanctions regime and putting the pressure on Iran that ultimately brought them to the table, and ensuring we had the accurate data and information and intelligence about what was going on in the Iranian nuclear program to be able to make the appropriate demands in the Iranian agreement that will ensure Iran does not achieve a nuclear weapon. An extraordinary amount of highly sensitive, frankly, very impressive security cooperation. It's resulted in things like the life-saving performance of Iron Dome, like David Sling coming to be deployed next year, like the advances in Arrow, the F-35, as I mentioned before. All of those are things that those two leaders decided together in quiet, respectful, professional discussions, and then instructed their governments and militaries and intelligence agencies to carry out. Those aren't self-executing. So I think there is an excessive focus on the sense of conflict between them and an underappreciation of the achievements that they both deserve credit for. And frankly, I think when history is written about this period, out of the day-to-day political kind of narrative and the tensions that I said exist in both countries, and maybe some people have an interest in stoking, I think the history will be kinder to both of them and kinder to what they achieved together than sometimes comes across in the day-to-day media coverage.
Yeah. Thanks for understanding our habits.
Well, you have a job to do.
Yeah. So I'm wondering now, I'd like to transition to a little more personal, some more personal topics. In your role, I am wondering what your personal relationship with Israel has been, not just the job, but what do you see as your primary connection to Israel, and whether it be in relationship with Judaism or just the state of Israel? Yeah.
Well, it goes back a very long way, and I can, in some ways, chart what I'm doing today from my parents' decision to spend time there on a sabbatical in 1973, which found us there on Yom Kippur when the 73 war broke out. And although I was very young, it became a very indelible part of our family history and forged a deep bond and a deep connection with Israel that stayed with me throughout my childhood and led me to make certain choices about studying Hebrew, about returning to spend time in Israel as a student after high school, and again in college at Hebrew University. That led me to even make choices about my academic pursuits, to study Hebrew and Arabic and Islam and Judaism and history and politics of the Middle East. And all of that put me on a professional path in a way that ultimately led to this position. So it's very deep, it's very personal. I don't think I would have been particularly interested in serving as our ambassador in any other country. Well, it would be a great honor to serve anywhere, and I don't undercut the value of many other relationships. For me personally, to uproot the family, to leave behind for a number of years our community here in Washington and be distant from our families overseas, I think it only made sense to do it in the country where we feel, both my wife and I and our kids, we have the strongest stake in the closest possible relationship between the United States and Israel. And so we've done that. It's been very fulfilling. It's been fulfilling, obviously, to spend time in Israel, spend time with our daughters there, help them develop their own relationships with Israel. But to do it in this role of the, if you will, one of the stewards of the U.S.-Israel relationship. As I said, it would be an honor to serve overseas anywhere, and anytime you have the opportunity to represent the United States and our flag and our values, that is a great honor. But to do it in the home of a great ally with whom we have personal connections and a lot of personal history and a lot of understanding of our own deep connections to it, it's that much more meaningful.
Mm-hmm. Now, we happen to share an alma mater. We both went to Brandeis for undergrad, and I know that I was, working for the student newspaper there. I was the editor of the student newspaper, and on a Jewish-heavy campus in terms of the student body, covering certain stories as a student journalist certainly informed my experience in the field right now. Particularly, the Brandeis administration hosted Jimmy Carter, former President Jimmy Carter, which was quite controversial at the time. Carter's visit to Brandeis due to his views on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I'm wondering if your experience in college at all informed your experience right now in the Jewish or Israel-related world, so to speak.
Well, it certainly did. I mean, in addition to my academic studies, I was a Near Eastern and Judaic Studies major, mostly history, but you couldn't stay completely uninformed, of course, about the current politics. But the friends that Julie and I were closest to then, and many of them we remain closest to, were all people who had placed a high priority on their own personal relationships with Israel and being active and understanding of what was happening in Israel and expressing that in whatever stream it made most sense to them to do so. Those years were during the first Intifada, so obviously there was a lot of focus on the cause of that violence, the cause of those terrorist events, but also the questions that Israelis, for the first time really since 1967, many of them were dealing with about what is the possible future for Israel as in terms of its occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and its relationship with the Palestinians. And ultimately, just a few years later than that, the Madrid conference and then the Oslo Accords, I think, grew out of that period. So many of us as students were grappling with those very same questions ourselves on campus. How to be supportive of Israel, how to be supportive of Israelis fighting terror, how to strengthen a U.S.-Israel relationship that was going through its own transition, and how also to be voices in support of reconciliation and peace and finding ways to break down that which divided Israelis and Palestinians and Israelis and others. The campus, as you know, was a kind of you mentioned one prominent speaker, but it was a regular stop for some of the leading voices from every perspective. We had strong peace advocates come to visit, including one of the first delegation of American Jews that met with Yasser Arafat, Drora Kass, and she came and spoke, and it was very controversial for a lot of people, but she wanted to explain why she felt that was the right step to do. Michael Lerner of Tikkun Magazine was another. But on another day, Meir Kahane came. In fact, Meir Kahane came and spoke in the Brandeis Student Union 5 days before he was assassinated in New York City. And again, a very sort of significant and controversial event. And then lots of connections with Israeli culture and society. David Broza came and played his concerts, and many other artists and writers would come through. So it was a very rich environment in which to build and strengthen that relationship, but it meant asking a lot of hard questions of ourselves and of each other and of our community, most of which I think we're still asking ourselves. I don't think everyone ever reaches a real end to that set of questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now back to the president. Over the course of these almost now 2 full terms, there has been, consistent criticism in some parts of the Jewish community about the president's policy towards Israel. The bulk of the criticism being twofold: that the president is, let's say, soft on Islamic terrorism and issues like that, as well as disproportionately critical of Israel as compared to previous administrations. So I'm wondering, as ambassador, what your take is on that criticism, what your response is, how you deal with the issue, if at all. Yeah.
Well, obviously, I'm very proud to serve this president, this administration, and wouldn't do so unless I felt that I was serving a president who absolutely shared my values of the importance of this relationship, the importance of doing everything that we need to do to help ensure Israel's security and help Israel achieve peace with its neighbors. Of course, it's his administration, it's his policies. Sometimes in Israel, where people say a lot of nice things about me as an ambassador who speaks Hebrew and as an ambassador who is connected with society and has spent a lot of time there, and I think shows evidence of a personal stake. People say things like, we really like you, Ambassador Shapiro, but we don't like President Obama. And I say to them, that's wrong. I don't validate him. He validates me. He appointed me. I'm in Israel carrying out exactly the policies that he wants me to carry out. I've not one time found the White House calling me to say, why did you do X or Y or say X or Y? And I've not had one time where I've called back and said, I have a real problem with what I'm being asked to do. All of it is of a piece. It is of a piece of a president who really going well back into his early days in public life, long before he was even a United States Senator, has spoken out about his own belief in Israel's legitimacy and the importance of the Jewish people having a homeland, of America's obligation to provide for Israel's security, even in times and in places and among political constituencies where that wasn't necessarily the most popular thing he could have said. But those are deeply held values that he has. It is also the case that he, as do so many people who feel close to and love Israel, feels that Israel has a serious challenge. How is it going to disentangle from the Palestinians so that it doesn't have a one-state future, it doesn't have a binational future that really calls into question the Jewish and democratic nature of the state, and it poses its own long-term security challenge. And the flip side, the opportunity that presents to solve that conflict, to open up Israel to relationships with the Arab world, to bring to an end many of the questions that are raised in Europe and elsewhere about Israel's legitimacy. Wrong questions, and questions that there will always be some people who will raise, and perhaps in the BDS movement, but I don't think there's any question that an end to the conflict in which it's understood that is the end, and the end of claims, and recognition of Israel as a Jewish state, those are all things he has stood for and spoken for out of a sense not only that it serves America's interest, obviously his primary focus, but clearly out of a sense that these are what any good ally would do for an ally like Israel facing the dilemmas and the challenges that it does live with. I know we're not going to satisfy every critic. I know there will always be people who will have something they don't like, and maybe it's this statement or that statement or this disagreement or that disagreement with the Prime Minister. But I'm, I'll end where I started, immensely proud to represent him and the policies he's pursued. And I don't feel any conflict at all with my own personal commitments about Israel and about this relationship.
So we're at this conference. American Jewry holds many conferences throughout the year, um, but you know, and at these conferences, I would say that American Jews try to understand Israel and policy relating to Israel, what Jewish organizations worldwide are doing on the ground in Israel, and so on and so forth. We don't often talk about how the Israeli community is trying to understand the American Jewish community, but you happen to keynote the launch of a program, an academic program in Israel, in Haifa. It's the Ruderman Family Foundation's program for American Jewish Studies for Israeli students to gain a better understanding of our community here. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the need for such a program to give Israelis a better understanding and make it more of a two-way street in this relationship.
Well, it's an important question because I think one can observe that there are trends in both societies, and the Jewish community in the United States is an element of that, but certainly not the only element, that over time, if not tended, could lead to a kind of a feeling of a distancing between our societies, where we might look across the ocean and say, gee, we don't recognize each other as well as we thought we did, and we don't necessarily have the same focus. It doesn't necessarily one of values, but it certainly might have to do with self-identification and priorities and self-expression. And so I'm a huge believer in the importance of helping educate both communities about each other. And obviously there are many, many excellent programs that are sponsored by the American Jewish community to send young American Jews to Israel and spend time as students and travel and living with Israeli families. I benefited from such programs and strongly would encourage people to consider those opportunities. And there's a need, I think, for similar opportunities for Israelis to come to the United States. So I am a big supporter of the Ruderman program. I think it was a terrific choice of how to focus their resources in Israel on helping educate Israelis about the American Jewish community. Because if you go even to fairly sophisticated Israelis, and that includes many political leaders, many members of Knesset, and ask them to describe the degradations of the American Jewish community, the different religious movements, some of the organizational structure, some of the values that animate at least certain segments of our community. It's quite striking to find, they often really are not able to do it. That it's understandable in a way because they just haven't spent time here and they haven't gone out into those communities and built those relationships. So a program like the Ruderman one, which will build a cadre of experts who can then educate the rest of Israeli society about these different trends and different characteristics of the American Jewish community, is extremely beneficial. At the U.S. Embassy, we sponsor programs that perform some of the same function and broader functions. There are visas, a special visa category available for young Israelis to come and serve as camp counselors. And probably almost everybody at this conference has had some relationship with a Jewish summer camp and probably with Israeli counselors at those camps. And those are really transformative experiences for the Americans who have Israelis to come to them, but equally for the Israelis who see a side of American Jewish life that they would never have seen otherwise and go home and take those lessons. We sponsor many other forms of exchanges to get Israelis over here to the United States, and we don't want to limit it to just the American Jewish community. The U.S. government's function and responsibility is to maximize opportunities for Israelis and Americans of every background to interact with each other. And I think in some ways we need to work even harder to get to non-Jewish elements of American society who don't know Israel as well and may not be as connected. And so we put a high priority on those types of exchanges as well. So this is an area where we really need to keep our focus on. In 15 or 20 years, left untended, as I said, our societies might find that they don't recognize each other as well and identify with each other the same way they historically have, as an outgrowth of natural demographic processes in both countries. There's nothing nefarious about it. It's just an expression of a certain natural process. So it takes work, it takes effort, it takes focused programs like Ruderman, like others that build relationships to help ensure something I very much hope is the case, that in 20 or 25 years from now, our people-to-people relationship is just as close and just as strong as it is today.
Okay, and just to end things, as an ambassador, you're in the business of diplomacy, and I'm wondering what you think of this area. Are you what you think of sometimes being able to speak freely, sometimes not being able to speak freely? Are you putting out fires, or, so to speak? Are you downplaying things? Are you looking forward to the time when you're in a different space that's not as diplomatic? I'm wondering what you think of the territory.
You're asking a diplomat to critique diplomacy, I think.
Yes.
Well, look, obviously anybody who works for, who serves any government has a limit to what they express publicly to the views of that government. As I mentioned earlier, if there was any deep or significant conflict between what I'm asked to represent and my own personal views, I wouldn't be doing it. So I don't feel any constraint in that regard. But obviously, I have my own observations and my own opinions, and I sometimes express them internally, and sometimes I express them quietly to my wife at home. And there may come a time when it's appropriate to write about that and express those things. But that I think goes with the territory. When you sign up to represent your government, again, it's a huge honor. It's a huge responsibility. You do give away a certain bit of freedom of your own public expression, and that's a price that I'm certainly took into account, but also don't feel as a burden that in any way outweighs the honor and the responsibility that I'm asked to carry out. So I'll save the anecdotes and the tart observations perhaps until some future interview we do.
Save it for the book. All right. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jim, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.